that limits state and local cooperation with the federal government in enforcing gun laws is unconstitutional.
And their recent actions against firearms manufacturers, federal firearms licenses, or FFLs.
If we can't save all lives, it's not worth saving a single life. Well, I suppose that.
And that is pass some gun reform legislation to keep our communities safe.
Supreme Court denies protections. Hey there, folks. Let's dive into the nitty-gritty of a hot-off-the-press Supreme Court decision that's been making waves. The highest court in the land, in an 8-1 verdict, just threw a curveball at Missouri's Second Amendment Preservation Act. So, what's all the fuss about? Well, it's a big deal, and here's why. First off, let's get one thing straight. The Second Amendment Preservation Act is no small fry. This Missouri law, dating back to 2021, is a sort of superhero cape for the Second Amendment enthusiasts in the state. It's all about setting the record straight on what the Second Amendment means to Missourians and putting the brakes on any federal law that dares to cross that line. In a nutshell, the law tells state agents, hands off! It says, you folks in the state government aren't allowed to lend a hand to those pesky federal agents who are out there enforcing laws that don't jive with our beloved Second Amendment. So this was no quiet affair. The U.S. government wasn't too pleased with Missouri's interpretation of the Second Amendment. They argued that the state had it all wrong. They said, you're breaking the constitutional rules. So off to court they went. The U.S. government basically said, your law is as unconstitutional as mismatched socks. The district court, in reviewing the case, agreed with Uncle Sam, and not only did they say, your socks don't match, but they threw in an injunction for good measure. This injunction put the brakes on Missouri, meaning they couldn't enforce their law at all. It was essentially a legal red light for the whole act. Missouri wasn't taking this lying down, though. They appealed the decision and tried to pull a fast one by asking for a stay. A stay would essentially freeze the district court's decision, a bit like hitting the pause button on a movie. But guess what? The 8th Circuit, where the appeal landed, wasn't having it. They said, no pause button for you. That meant Missouri had to take their case all the way to the big show, the Supreme Court. So what happened when the Supreme Court weighed in? Well, in a vote of 8-1, they said, sorry Missouri, no stay for you either. Justice Clarence Thomas was the one dissenter, arguing that they should have granted the stay. But there you have it, the Supreme Court's final word. No stay for Missouri. Now, what does all this mean? Is it game over for Missouri's Second Amendment Preservation Act? Not exactly. The Supreme Court's decision isn't the final verdict on the law's constitutionality. It just means they won't hit the pause button on the district court's decision. This case is still very much alive and kicking. The lower courts will continue to chew it over, and Missouri will have to play by the district court's rules for now. So while the Supreme Court's decision is a speed bump, it's not the end of the road for this legal saga. Stay tuned, folks. There's more to come in the Second Amendment Preservation Act showdown. Background of the Second Amendment Preservation Act. In 2021, Missouri made a significant legal move with the enactment of the Second Amendment Preservation Act. This act was not your run-of-the-mill legislation. It was a robust declaration of the state's stance on the Second Amendment of the U.S. Constitution. The primary goal of this act was to establish the state's very own interpretation of the Second Amendment and to put restrictions on the enforcement of federal laws that didn't align with this interpretation. Missouri lawmakers, in passing this act, wanted to make a powerful statement about their unwavering commitment to the Second Amendment. They firmly believed that the federal government had it all wrong in its interpretation of this constitutional right. As a result, they decided to take matters into their own hands and assert their authority when it came to the Second Amendment within their state's borders. The first mission of the Second Amendment Preservation Act was to set the record straight. It explicitly defined the state's interpretation of the Second Amendment. In essence, it aimed to leave no room for ambiguity. Missourians had the unequivocal right to keep and bear arms. It was a clear and resolute declaration of the state's beliefs. The second mission of the act was equally crucial. It intended to put a leash on federal laws. State agents, according to the act, were strictly prohibited from providing any form of assistance to federal agents in the enforcement of laws that contradicted the state's interpretation of the Second Amendment. In simpler terms, the state officials were instructed not to act as enforcers of federal gun laws that went against the state's stance. This wasn't merely a symbolic gesture. The act had real teeth. It granted any citizen of Missouri the power to take legal action against state officials who dared to aid in the enforcement of federal laws that violated the Second Amendment. The act imposed substantial penalties, with potential civil fines starting at $50,000 per government employee involved. It was a clear signal that Missouri was prepared to defend its interpretation of the Second Amendment vigorously. In essence, the Second Amendment Preservation Act amounted to a declaration of state sovereignty concerning the Second Amendment. It asserted that Missouri was fully capable of defining and defending its interpretation of this constitutional right, regardless of federal guidelines. This legal maneuver set the stage for what would become a contentious legal battle, which would be explored in more detail as events unfolded. Missouri's intent was clear. They were determined to protect and uphold their own interpretation of the Second Amendment, and they were willing to face the legal consequences head-on.
The justices, in a brief order, rejected an emergency request filed by the state. The case reflects clashing interpretations of the right to bear arms under the Constitution's Second Amendment. Now, that's the important piece. This has gone from the Eighth Circuit, now it went to SCOTUS. SCOTUS denied. They completely said, no, you can't enforce federal laws under the Second Amendment preservation area.
The purpose of the Missouri law. The core purpose of the Missouri law, known as the Second Amendment Preservation Act, is to establish a staunch defense of the Second Amendment within the state and to place clear limits on the role of state agents in assisting federal authorities. In essence, SAPA is all about drawing a line in the sand and saying, this is where state sovereignty begins and federal overreach ends. One of the most central intentions of SAPA is to create a legal barrier to prevent state agents from providing any form of aid, cooperation, or resources to federal agents when they are attempting to enforce laws that run contrary to Missouri's interpretation of the Second Amendment. This sends a powerful message that Missouri stands firmly behind its own understanding of the Second Amendment and is not willing to lend a hand in the enforcement of federal regulations that contradict it. To reinforce the seriousness of this commitment, SAPA includes a legal mechanism that gives individual Missouri citizens the authority to take legal action against state officials who choose to support or assist in the enforcement of these federal laws. In essence, the law empowers the citizens of Missouri to act as watchdogs and hold their own government accountable for any collaboration with federal agencies in implementing laws that infringe upon the Second Amendment. This is where the civil remedy comes into play. If a Missouri citizen believes that a state official has overstepped their bounds by supporting federal laws that go against the Second Amendment, as interpreted by the state, they can take legal action. Such action can result in civil penalties against the state officials involved, starting at a substantial amount of $50,000 per government employee. These civil remedies not only provide a legal means for citizens to protect their Second Amendment rights, but also serve as a deterrent for state agents who might otherwise be tempted to assist in the enforcement of federal laws that contradict the state's position. In sum, the core intention of the Missouri law, SAPA, is to firmly establish the state's interpretation of the Second Amendment, while creating a legal mechanism that allows Missouri citizens to take legal action against state agents who provide support to federal agents in enforcing laws that contradict this interpretation. This represents a significant move by the state of Missouri to defend its sovereignty and protect the rights of its citizens concerning the Second Amendment.
Supreme Court of the United States, Missouri versus United States, on application for a stay, said, no, you can't do that, so where does that leave sanctuary cities? Again, the whole picture, this is a key point. The application for stay presented to Justice Kavanaugh and by him referred to the court is denied. Thomas would have done it. You got Kavanaugh, Gorsuch, and Alito who said, no, we're not doing it.
The legal challenge by the United States government. The legal challenge launched by the U.S. government against the Missouri law, known as the Second Amendment Preservation Act, was a high-stakes showdown that raised important constitutional questions. The federal government's argument essentially revolved around the claim that SAPA was unconstitutional due to its interpretation of the Second Amendment. At the heart of the U.S. government's challenge was a fundamental dispute over how the Second Amendment should be understood. The federal government contended that Missouri's interpretation, as outlined in SAPA, was incorrect and not in line with the broader interpretation upheld at the federal level. This presented a classic case of federal versus state interpretation of constitutional rights, a recurring theme in American constitutional law. The legal basis for the U.S. government's challenge was rooted in the Supremacy Clause of the U.S. Constitution, which is found in Article 6, Clause 2. This clause establishes that the Constitution, federal laws, and treaties are the supreme law of the land, and it mandates that state judges must follow federal law, even if state laws conflict with them. The federal government's argument hinged on the principle that state law cannot supersede or undermine federal law, especially when it comes to interpreting the Constitution. Therefore, they contended that Missouri's attempt to establish its interpretation of the Second Amendment, which was in contradiction to federal interpretations, was unconstitutional under the Supremacy Clause. In a broader context, this challenge touched on the fundamental concept of federalism and the division of powers between the federal and state governments. The federal government argued that when it came to constitutional rights, the interpretation should remain uniform across the nation, with federal law being the ultimate authority. In contrast, Missouri maintained its position that it should have the authority to define and protect the Second Amendment as it saw fit within its borders. This legal challenge was not just about the Second Amendment. It was about the balance of power and the supremacy of federal law versus state law. It brought to the forefront the ongoing struggle between the federal government and individual states over the interpretation and protection of constitutional rights. The outcome of this challenge would have far-reaching implications for the scope of state sovereignty and the relationship between federal and state governments in the context of constitutional rights. Comparison to the Texas abortion law. The comparison between the Missouri law, the Second Amendment Preservation Act, and the Texas abortion law, Senate Bill 8, is a fascinating dive into two distinct legal battles that share a unique common feature: empowering citizens to enforce the law. This feature adds an intriguing layer of complexity to the legal challenges surrounding these two laws. First, let's take a quick look at SB 8. This Texas abortion law garnered significant attention because it prohibits abortions once a fetal heartbeat is detected, typically around 6 weeks into pregnancy. But what set it apart from other abortion laws was its enforcement mechanism. Instead of relying on state officials to enforce the law, SB 8 enabled private citizens to sue anyone who performed or aided and abetted an abortion in violation of the law. In essence, it allowed individual citizens to act as the enforcers of the law rather than the state. Now, fast forward to Missouri SAPA. While the issue at hand, the Second Amendment, was entirely different, the structural approach was remarkably similar. Just as in SB 8, SAPA turned to the people, the citizens of Missouri, to act as the enforcers of the law. In this case, the law permitted any Missouri citizen to sue state officials who assisted in the enforcement of federal gun laws that the state deemed as infringing on the Second Amendment. It also included the potential for substantial civil penalties, starting at $50,000 per government employee. The shared feature here is clear. The enforcement mechanism was not left in the hands of state authorities, but was entrusted to private individuals. Both laws essentially said, "We won't enforce this law ourselves, it's up to the people to do so."
Organize, don't organize, organize. We are the majority.
Experts say using the word heartbeat is misleading since the activity detected is electrical impulses.
They're not pro-life, they're pro-hypocrisy, pro-birth, and pro-control.
This similarity in structure had profound implications for the legal challenges surrounding these laws. For one, it made it inherently tricky to challenge the laws in court. The courts typically issue injunctions against state officials to stop the enforcement of a law. However, when the enforcement power is in the hands of private individuals, obtaining a comprehensive injunction becomes far more challenging. In the case of SB 8, it meant that lawsuits against individual citizens performing or aiding abortions would need to be filed one by one, making it hard to halt the law's enforcement entirely. This unique feature added a layer of complexity and intrigue to both the SB 8 abortion law and Missouri SAPA. The legal challenges were not just about the constitutionality of the laws themselves, but also about the practicality of enforcement and the balance of power between the government and the citizens. It raised essential questions about the reach of state authority, the role of individual citizens in law enforcement, and the broader legal landscape in which these laws existed. In essence, while these laws addressed entirely different issues, they shared a structural similarity that had a significant impact on the complexity of the legal challenges surrounding them. Both highlighted the evolving nature of lawmaking and the creative ways in which states were asserting their rights and shifting the enforcement power from the government to the people.
Not a true heartbeat, as the embryo's heart isn't fully developed.
I'm trying not to cry because I don't want them to get an image of me crying.
The Mississippi law has been blocked by lower courts, so it is not in effect.
District Court's decision and injunction. The District Court's decision in the case of the Missouri law, the SAPA, was a critical juncture in the legal battle. It played a significant role in shaping the course of the proceedings and determining the fate of SAPA. The District Court, after a thorough review of the case, came down with a ruling that struck at the heart of SAPA. They declared the Missouri law to be unconstitutional. This decision was a significant blow to SAPA's supporters and a substantial victory for those who were challenging the law's validity. One of the immediate consequences of the District Court's decision was the issuance of an injunction. An injunction is a court order that effectively puts a stop to the enforcement of a law or a particular provision of it.
If they were truly pro-life, they would not support the Supreme Court's decision to allow open carry across this country.
SB 8 very much is, after the Supreme Court declined to step in sooner.
They would support these things that actually affect the living, breathing human lives.
Legal abortion on demand!
They would support gun control. They would support universal health care.
In the case of SAPA, the District Court's injunction puts the brakes on the state of Missouri, essentially preventing it from enforcing the law. Now let's dig into the specifics of this injunction. The District Court's order wasn't a sweeping prohibition of the entire SAPA law. It was more precise than that. It specifically prohibited the state of Missouri and its officers, agents, and employees from implementing and enforcing SAPA. In other words, it targeted those directly connected to the state government, preventing them from enforcing the law. The reasoning behind this injunction was rooted in the District Court's determination that SAPA was unconstitutional. They held that the law's attempt to create its own interpretation of the Second Amendment and restrict the enforcement of federal gun laws was in direct conflict with the Supremacy Clause of the U.S. Constitution. The Supremacy Clause establishes that federal law takes precedence over state law, making federal law the supreme law of the land. The District Court's injunction, therefore, aimed to maintain the status quo, ensuring that federal law would continue to be the governing authority in the realm of firearms regulation within Missouri. It was a practical measure taken to prevent state officials from acting in a manner inconsistent with federal law. The injunction's specific scope was pivotal. While it limited the enforcement powers of the state and its agents, it did not prevent private individuals from pursuing legal action under SAPA. This meant that citizens of Missouri could still sue state officials if they believed they were helping to enforce federal gun laws that were contrary to the Second Amendment, just as SAPA intended. However, the state was essentially sidelined from enforcing the law themselves. Missouri's appeal and request for a stay. Following the District Court's decision to declare the SAPA unconstitutional and issue an injunction, Missouri swiftly initiated a legal response. The state was not willing to accept this setback without a fight and pursued an appeal, taking their case to the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Eighth Circuit. They also made a significant move by requesting a stay on the injunction issued by the District Court. The appeal to the Eighth Circuit was a strategic decision on Missouri's part. It marked a step in their effort to challenge the District Court's ruling and seek a different outcome at a higher judicial level. The appeal provided an opportunity for the state to present arguments and legal reasoning to counter the District Court's decision. One of the key legal arguments put forth by Missouri in their appeal was that the District Court's decision was fundamentally flawed. They contested the court's determination that SAPA was unconstitutional and asserted that the law was well within the state's rights. In their view, the Supremacy Clause was not violated by SAPA, and they had the authority to define and protect their interpretation of the Second Amendment within their borders. Furthermore, Missouri's appeal argued that the District Court's injunction was overly broad. It pointed out that the injunction, as it stood, not only prevented state officials from enforcing SAPA, but also had the unintended consequence of inhibiting private individuals from pursuing legal action as allowed by the law. This, Missouri contended, exceeded the court's equitable powers and unfairly restricted the rights of its citizens.
Justice Thomas would grant the application for the stay. Statement of Justice Gorsuch, with whom Justice Alito joins, to the Jim Jordan saga, to an AR ban success victory, and now we're at the SAPA. The Supreme Court on Friday declined to block a judge's ruling that a novel Missouri statute they may have just destroyed sanctuary cities forever utilizing the Second Amendment. Check this out.
In conjunction with their appeal, Missouri also made a significant move by requesting a stay on the injunction. This meant that they asked the Eighth Circuit to put a temporary hold on the enforcement of the district court's injunction while the appeal was pending. The purpose of this stay was to essentially press the pause button on the district court's order and maintain the status quo regarding SAPA's enforcement until the appeal process was completed. The request for a stay was of crucial importance. It was an effort to prevent the immediate effects of the district court's injunction, giving Missouri more time to argue their case in the appeals process. In other words, the state aimed to maintain its ability to enforce SAPA while the legal battles played out. Supreme Court's denial of the stay. The Supreme Court's denial of the stay request regarding SAPA was a significant development in the legal battle. The denial was met with both anticipation and scrutiny and offered insights into the justices' perspectives on this complex case. The Supreme Court's decision was far from unanimous, with an 8-1 vote. Justice Thomas was the sole justice who would have granted the application for a stay, indicating his belief that Missouri should have been granted a temporary halt to the district court's injunction. However, the majority of the Supreme Court decided to deny the stay request. In addition to the denial of the stay, two justices, Justice Gorsuch and Justice Alito, issued a statement respecting the denial of the application. Their statement shed light on the reasoning behind the majority's decision. In their statement, Justices Gorsuch and Alito clarified that the district court's injunction was specific in its scope. It only prohibited the implementation and enforcement of SAPA by the state of Missouri and its officers, agents, and employees, or any others acting in concert with them. The crucial point highlighted in this statement was that the district court's injunction did not restrict private parties from bringing lawsuits to enforce SAPA. The essence of their argument was that while the district court's injunction curtailed the state's ability to enforce SAPA, it did not hinder the law's enforcement by individual citizens. In other words, citizens could still sue state officials for their involvement in enforcing federal gun laws they believed infringed upon the Second Amendment. This statement by Justices Gorsuch and Alito essentially signaled that the district court's injunction, while impacting the state's role in enforcing SAPA, did not nullify the law's purpose or the power given to citizens to enforce it. It also emphasized that the issue before the Supreme Court was not the constitutionality of SAPA itself, but rather the scope of the injunction issued by the district court. Implications of the Supreme Court's decision. The Supreme Court's decision to deny a stay request in the case of SAPA holds significant implications and raises complex legal questions. This decision maintains the district court's injunction, preventing the state of Missouri and its officials from enforcing SAPA. While it restricts the state's ability to enforce the law directly, it does not negate the core feature of SAPA, which empowers individual citizens to bring legal action against state officials who they believe are aiding in the enforcement of federal gun laws that contradict SAPA. The decision does not provide a final verdict on the constitutionality of SAPA or the broader clash between state authority and federal law. This means that the legal battles surrounding SAPA are far from over and are expected to continue in lower courts. The case delves into critical legal principles, particularly the tension between federalism and the supremacy clause of the U.S. Constitution. It questions the extent of which states can assert their own interpretations of constitutional rights and potentially limit the enforcement of federal laws, raising broader questions about the balance of power between the federal government and individual states. The decision may have repercussions in other states with similar laws or intentions. It could influence their approach to defining and safeguarding their interpretation of constitutional rights and the mechanisms for enforcement. The legal strategies and precedents established in the Missouri case may serve as references for other states' efforts in this domain. Future of the Second Amendment Preservation Act case. The future of the SAPA case is marked by legal complexity and uncertainty. Despite the Supreme Court's denial of the stay request, the case is far from over. and several key factors will influence its trajectory. The role of the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Eighth Circuit is paramount. As the stage for Missouri's appeal, this circuit will evaluate the arguments presented by both proponents and opponents of SAPA. Their decision will determine whether the district court's ruling, which declared SAPA unconstitutional and issued an injunction, should stand. The Eighth Circuit's judgment will provide further clarity on the legal landscape surrounding SAPA. The statement issued by Justices Gorsuch and Alito, accompanying the Supreme Court's denial of the stay request, is also noteworthy. Other states with similar laws or ambitions to assert their interpretations of constitutional rights will likely monitor the case closely. They may adapt their legal strategies based on the precedents and tactics developed in the SAPA case, making it a focal point for debates on the balance of power between individual states and the federal government. That's all for this video, folks. See you next time.